CD5. The Earth travelled elegantly along its orbit, tilted on its axis somewhat like the governor, Rook thought, bearing the settlement into the full heat of summer. A week had passed since his meeting with Silk, but something in Rook was still reverberating, a disturbance in the air, a tremor in his sense of himself. He heard them before he saw them. "Camera! Camera!" Tagaran with Tugir and Worragon, almost falling down the rocks in their haste to reach the hut. No one else, none of the women, none of the other children, just these three, landing at his door in the afternoon, breathless and crying. Heavens, what has happened? What is wrong? Tagaran was in disarray, as he had never seen her. Her face wet with tears, her mouth shaking, air heaving raggedly in and out. She was trembling like a horse after a gallop. He saw brilliant red blood on her arm and her side. She panted out a stream of words. He could not understand a single one. "Get in, girls. Get in by the fire." He spread a blanket for them to sit on, threw sticks on the fire. He had little enough in the hut, but poured them each a cup of water, found the hard old slab of biscuit that was to have been his meagre supper, and gave them each a piece, leaving himself a mouthful. Tugir was sobbing, would not taste the water or the biscuit, sat with her knees up to her shoulders. Tagaran took a deep breath to try to calm her breathing, and was racked by an enormous hiccup, then another. She smiled crookedly and started to say something, hiccuped again, and all at once the crisis was over. Tugir laughing and banging Tagaran on the back until she angled her elbow up to make us stop. "Now tell me, girls, what has happened. What is this about?" Tugir and Worragon looked at Tagaran. She spoke, but too fast. He caught White Man, all the rest was a blur. "I cannot understand you," he said. "Mapiadimi." "Piedangala, White Mana, Ngalari, Tugena," Tagaran repeated, one word at a time for his benefit. In Piedangala, Rook could hear a stem he knew. Pi, to beat. Even as his brain was computing the meaning, his heart was shrinking. A white man beat Tugir. He did not have to unravel all the implications of this to know that it was something he did not want to hear. Tagaran was energetically acting out an angry face, a hand rising and falling. He could see it all, only too clearly. Some outraged marine or truculent convict. For a moment he saw Brugden's powerful shoulders, imagined his arm bent back to strike. She showed him how the beating had opened a long cut on her arm and hurt her finger. Showed him the long stick-shaped wheal where blood was beading on Tugir's back. She turned her face up to him, full of pain and outrage. He cradled her hand in his own and looked at it, bent the finger gently and watched her face. It was not broken, but it was swollen. He picked up her other hand, comparing the swollen finger with the other. He went carefully so he would not touch the injured part, but she pulled back. Did ye? There was an accusing note to her voice, although he could not have caused her pain. He leaned forward to have a better look at the cut on Tugir's back, but she flinched in fear. Her face was turned away. "Minion Barakut, Tugir Minion?" he said. "Why are you afraid, Tugir?" Without looking at him, she muttered, "Mulayin, because of the men." Tagaran pointed to the cut, as if he could not see it, or could not understand that it hurt. "Did ye murray?" Something like, "It is very painful." Rook could not stop himself thinking of that other back he had so recently seen. Had Tagaran seen it? He thought not. But something about her manner told him that she had heard about it. He could not meet her eye. She told him the story again, with even more dramatic gestures. Her voice was shrill with outrage. Then she watched him. Rook knew what she wanted. She wanted him to ask questions. Who did this to you? Why? Where is he now? She wanted him to join her in indignation, to put on his jacket and stride away to the settlement to deal with the white man who had beaten them. But there was a heavy place inside him, where the event was sitting undigested like a piece of bad food. Gaia muri Yorawar, he said. I'm very angry. But he knew that he did not sound angry. What he heard in his voice was a dragging reluctance, a withholding. Ungalariwa? Tagaran asked. With us? No, of course not with you. It was such a wrong idea that he looked at her in surprise. Meeting her gaze, he saw that she had asked the question to make him look at her. Camera and Gini Pieba, she asked. Camera, will you speak? He had never thought that he might wish to understand less. This exchange was not a language lesson. It was a conversation. For the first time, he and Tagaran were on the same side of the mirror of language, simply speaking to each other. Understanding went in both directions. Once two people shared language, they could no longer use it to hide. Unganawa, he said. To whom? Charlotte Birang, she said, to the person belonging to Charlotte. Not Brugden, then, but one of the sailors. He imagined himself being rowed out to Charlotte, asking to see the captain. Sir, some man from your ship has beaten 3 native girls. I wish you to discover and punish him. The captain would look at him. Really, Lieutenant? Native girls, eh? Some sailor or other would be brought up from below, would stand wooden-faced the way they were taught. He would have the story ready about how he had gone ashore and the girls had stolen his bread or his pipe. He could imagine the scene, but not himself in it. The girls were a tableau of brown limbs and angled faces, and eyes watching Lieutenant Rook, trying to imagine the impossible. Yenaru biscuit, Worrigan said. May I go and fetch the biscuit that is still left? He thought he had managed the business of giving them biscuit while leaving a fragment for himself, but they had not missed a single thing. Not about the biscuit, much less about the fact that Camera was not going to stand up for them. He got the piece of biscuit and tried to amuse them by grimacing and grunting, trying to break it and failing. It was rock-like. He did not have to pretend, until he picked up the hatchet from beside the fire and chopped it into 3. Worrigan and Tugir were willing to be amused by his play-acting. He was waiting for Tagaran to forgive him. As he gave her some biscuit, he pointed to her finger. Morabidyul, he asked, hoping this might mean finger better. Bil Karangan, she said, shaking her head and making a face. Not better, but worse, he supposed. Still, she seemed to have accepted that sympathy was as far as he was going to go. When they had finished their morsels of biscuit, she made a great show of playing hostess, introducing the others to various mysteries of the hut that were new to them. She demonstrated how you made a spark with the flint, showed them how you sharpened the hatchet with the whetstone. She opened the box to show them the sextant. She wagged her finger in warning not to touch and pointed up. As she herself had done the first day, the 2 girls looked at the shingles, and he watched her give out a stream of words, the meaning of which he was pretty sure was close to, "No, silly, not the roof, the stars." There were few enough objects in the hut for him to be aware of her avoiding the one in the corner behind the door, his musket. In the absence of enough pegs and shelves, its muzzle had made a convenient spot for him to hook small items of clothing. Most of the time he could forget that it was a weapon. But now he was aware of it there, and of Tagaran ignoring it. Then Tugir said something, and they were off, suddenly, like a flock of those chattering birds that came down to the grass and then all took fright at once. He watched them clambering up the rocks. Near the top they turned and waved. "Goodbye! Goodbye! Goodbye!" How they seemed to love the sound of that word. He waved until they had disappeared over the crest of the ridge, and even then went on standing there, looking up. When he went into the hut, he could no longer avoid a glum awareness of failure. What Tagaran had wanted was impossible. He tried it in his mind again, going out to Charlotte, knocking on the door of the captain's cabin, the man looking at him. "Native girls, you say?" Impossible. He thought that Tagaran knew all along that it was a test he would fail, and she had forgiven him. It only confirmed something that she understood already. In this, as in so many other things, she was ahead of him. They all knew what he had turned his face away from. Like it or not, he was Berewalgal. He wore the red coat. He carried the musket when he was told to. He stood by while a man was flogged. He would not confront a white man who had beaten his friends. He had been pretending that it was not so. A world existed here in his hut, a world he shared with Tagaran and the others. It was on another orbit altogether from the one he shared with his own kind. But a man could not travel along two different paths. Tagaran knew that. Now he knew it too. The gloom that had fallen over his day was a fact he had until now denied, that the pleasure he found with Tagaran cast a shadow. He had been brushed by its wing this afternoon, just a touch. It would return. What he shared with Tagaran was the greatest delight he had ever known. But bound up with the delight, inseparable from it, was a universe of impossibility. There was this about Sydney Cove, Rook thought. At the end of every summer's day, the nor'easter came through, as dependably as if someone out in the endless waters of the Pacific Ocean were paid to open a window. The forest-covered promontories seethed under gusts of wind that darkened the water to gunmetal grey. Rook considered destroying the notebooks. He would make a copy that would omit any entries which could be misunderstood and burn the originals. He got as far as sitting at the table and opening a new notebook, but could not make himself go on. To read the entries with an eye for what could be distorted would be to distort them. He would enter that coarse way of looking and be dirted by it. Making an expurgated version of the notebooks would kill them. Like a stuffed parrot, they would be real, but not true. When he saw Barringen threading her way down the rocks, Boneda calling, "Camera, camera," and Tagaran a shining figure in the sun, he was glad. But he was also aware of something else in his heart. Could he want something and dread it at the same time? Some powerful conflict of feelings in the vicinity of his chest made him unable to return her greeting. Today it seemed the children did not want to crowd into the hut. Tagaran went in, though, and as he followed her, he could not stop himself looking up at the ridge, dreading to see Silk's dapper figure. Tagaran went straight to the corner, removed the handkerchief draped over the end of the musket, and picked it up. He put out a hand to stop her, but she had already got it snugged into her shoulder, and her finger was already against the trigger. Now she was pretending that she knew how to squint along its length. Where had she seen that done? And why had she waited till now to try the thing? The memory of that first day on the beach came into his mind, clear as an engraving in a frame. Waymark demonstrating the power of the white man's weapon, and himself laughing at the surgeon's blunt description of what a musket ball might do to a man. Rook had not really been amused. He wondered now what had possessed him to laugh. News of that display would have travelled from tribe to tribe. Tagaran had most likely heard of it. Was she thinking of that picture too? He smiled in a discouraging way, took the gun from her, put it back in the corner. But she picked it up again and stuck her finger in the end of the barrel. She was asking, what makes the shot come out? The governor had given orders that the Marines never let the natives see that it was necessary to put anything into the gun. They must think it is a thing itself, that its effect is as immediate and simple as that of their own lances, he had said. For the safety of us all, do not let them see the loading of it. So Rook shook his head, held up his thumb and asked her what it was called. She was not to be distracted. Her insistence today seemed different from her usual curiosity, when she might want to know how the lid came off the inkwell or what the buckle on a shoe was for. Or did it only seem different because of that new shadow over things? Finally, because he found it so hard to refuse her, he thought to go halfway. Against both his orders and his own dragging reluctance, he got down the bag of shot and emptied a ball out into his palm. She snatched it up, felt it, weighed it, and tried it with her teeth before giving it back. Rook loaded it into the muzzle, wadded it down. He watched her face, intent on the movement of the ramrod in and out. He could see that she had forgotten that he was Camera. For the moment he was nothing more than a conduit for the knowledge she wanted. His hands knew the movements of this ritual so well he could have loaded the gun with his eyes closed. In Portsmouth they had drilled endlessly, the sergeant calling out the actions one by one. It was incredible to Rook now, but he had seen in the gun only a marvel of logic and mechanics. On Tagaran's face he saw an echo of that fascination and wanted to say, "There is nothing to admire here." He hoped the palaver of loading and wadding the shot would be enough, but Tagaran was not fooled. She pointed to the pan, the duckbill hammer, the flint, demanded to see what they all did. So he showed her how the hammer struck the flint and made a spark, but still she knew there was more, and that it lived in the little bag up on the shelf. With ceremony and much appearance of care, he opened the bag and shook out a little powder into his palm. He put the pinch of powder on the pan, but did not do the essential thing. There was no powder behind the shot to spit it out along the muzzle. At least in the letter of the law, he was still on the right side of obedience. She followed him outside. He expected the women to be there sitting as usual around their fire. Boneda and the other children running about the rocks and up and down from the water, but for once they were nowhere to be seen. "Where is Mowbray? Where is Boneda?" he asked Tagaran. But she was not interested in the question, only in seeing what he would do next with the gun. There was something a little odd, a little unsettling about the emptiness of the place. Lucky, though he supposed, the noise he was about to make would have frightened the babies. Tagaran wanted to stand next to his shoulder, but he made her go back a few yards. She watched, huge-eyed, as he pretended to aim and pull his finger against the trigger. The flint fell against the steel. The spark fell onto the gunpowder in the pan. She jumped back at the bright flash and screamed, but it was more delight than fear. He could feel his face, stiff around the feelings the sound awoke in him. "There," he said, swinging the gun down from his shoulder and standing it butt up on the ground. "I have shown you everything. Does that make you content?" But she had not been taken in. She knew he had made noise and light, but that the shot was still in the barrel. Just for this day, he could have wished her stupid. With gestures that an imbecile could not have mistaken, she showed him what she wanted, to see the lead ball. She picked up another one to demonstrate, hurled itself out of the muzzle. He would not. The noise and flash were part of the allure of the machine, like fireworks or a person getting a note out of a tuba. But to shoot a piece of metal out of it that could penetrate a shield or a human body and expose the shambles within, that was of another order of experience, another language. What it said was, "I can kill you." He did not want her to learn that language, certainly not from him. "No, I will not. Bial, Bial!" She pouted and cajoled and wheedled. Then she turned to the sulks and called him Tamunalang, one who refuses, or he supposed a churl. He thought at first it must be a game. Tagaran gets her own way. But still she insisted, grabbing the barrel of the gun and pushing it at him. He was sickened by it, this innocent wanting to play at death. He thought she must see his misery at handling the gun, at being reminded that he was a soldier, his profession violence. Why did she insist? "No, do not ask, I beg you." For this appeal he had no Cadigal words. He had never before had to entreat her. He snatched the thing away from her and put it behind him, out of her reach, then took hold of her wrist to stop her taking it again. Her arm was thin as a twig, but strong. He could feel the sinewy power of it. "Come, girl," he cried at last. "Do not insist. I have said no." He could hear the anger in his voice, and she heard it too. She answered it with a flow of vehement words, spitting them out at him. He let her go and she took a step back. They watched each other. Suddenly it was no game. He was bewildered. He had never thought to use his strength against her, or to speak to her in anger. He watched her face, tightened against him, half hidden by her hair, her chin obstinate. He did not understand what had happened, except that it had to do with the wretched gun. He might as well have let it off. Something had been bent out of shape by his anger, as surely as it would have been by shooting. She turned away towards the door. He took a step after her. "Tomorrow," he said to her back. "Paribogo, will you come again tomorrow?" She spoke without looking at him. "Camara. Goodbye." What a terrible word that was. He could not say it in return. It was a word like a knife. "Paribogo. I will be here. Paribogo." But she had gone. He watched her climb up the track, her long, skinny legs moving tirelessly over the rocks. He was waiting for her to turn around. He would wave for her to come back. He would run up the track to join her. But she did not turn. When she had gone, Rook sat down on the side of his bed. His legs were trembling, and he could feel an obstacle in his throat, as if part of him were trying to get out. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air from the pinch he had exploded for her. The smell made him feel panicked and muddled. Why did Tagaran want to know how to fire a gun? He found his mind suggesting an answer. How would it be, just to speculate, if Tagaran had been chosen by the natives to learn the language of the great distance-off people, to learn their ways, even perhaps to make sense of the marks on paper that were so significant to them, to understand all their private inner workings of intellect, custom, belief, and feeling, and perhaps to find out how the guns worked, their powers, their limitations, how they might be countered by men with spears and wooden shields. A clever child like Tagaran was the perfect choice, quick to learn but innocent, curious, full of questions, but only a child. He thought of the way she absorbed words on a single hearing, made sense of entire sentences with amazing speed. She had learned more than she had ever taught him. He had begun by thinking of Tagaran as a resource. He thought he had appointed her his teacher. He had been made too confident by his own ambition. Brutally, he made himself face the last thought. He had been flattered by her friendship. Now, to put it plain, it seemed that he was the one who had been used. It hurt to have been taken for a fool. But that was not the pain in his throat, the constricted feeling, as if he were no longer sure how to breathe. The hurt that was choking him was that she had not enjoyed his company after all. She had valued him only for what he could give her, which was how he had begun by thinking of her, until now, when it was perhaps too late. The next day, after the noon readings, Rook set off up the track. At the top of the ridge, he did not go down towards the settlement, but in the opposite direction, towards the bay on the other side, the one called Long Cove. He had often seen the smoke rising there, and Tagaran had told him how the cockles and thick mud oysters loved the still water of that narrow bay. Once he had gone with her as far as a big rock from which the camp could be seen, a couple of bark shelters, a patch of cleared earth, a fire. She had made it clear that he should not go further, and he had not insisted. He had thought there would be other days, other opportunities. Standing beside that rock today, he could see that the cove was empty. No smoke rose from the mound of coals on the cleared space. The huts were still there, but empty. He felt a hollowness within, as if he had mislaid something and might not find it again. He sat down on the rock that was the boundary between his world and Tagaran's. The sun had already left the deep fold of the cove. The water was black, the mangroves sombre, merging with their reflected copies. The ridge on the other side of the cove was about to hide the sun. The earth was rolling on, carrying with it the speck of life that was Daniel Rook. Whatever took place down here among the rocks and the trees, where human beings stumbled through their days in confusion of spirit, the earth continued to spin on itself and to draw its gigantic ellipse. Its urge to fly out into space was precisely balanced by the inward pull of the sun. Whether an individual could see it or not, the sun was always blazing, always pulling, and the earth was always held by its mighty hand. The water shifted. 2 ducks crossed from one point to another. Somewhere on the far bank, a bird was making the same sound over and over. Wick, 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 as steadily as a man counting sheep through a gate. Out in the centre of the dark bay, a circular ripple formed that multiplied out and out, ring after perfect ring. All this was nothing but surface for him, surface without meaning. He could hear the bird, see the ripple. That was all. It was no further than a dog might understand. In Portsmouth he knew, so well he had forgotten ever learning it, that when the leaves of the plane trees become yellow and leathery, it meant that the weather would soon be cold. When the moon was ringed with a luminous pearliness, the next day the sea would be hurling broken water against the shingle. The fact of the leaves or the moon connected to other facts, each linked in the vast web of nature's logic. In New South Wales, he could not see how things were connected to any larger meaning. It gave life here an oddly disjointed and tiring aspect, like moving through the world blind. Tagaran knew the inner ligatures of this place in the way he knew those of Portsmouth. She would be blind there, he supposed, as he was here. She had asked him one day to tell her about the place he was from. A harbour like this one, he said, and pointed to show her. He had looked across the water towards the land of the Camaragal, and could see it as Portsmouth Harbour, looking over to Gosport. A little way across from shore to shore like this. She had listened solemnly, and looked where he was pointing. He remembered the boy he had been at her age, and all the afternoons he had spent on the stony beach under the tower, chilled through and through, but dreading the return to the academy. That boy had dreamed of beginning all over again, of a place where things could start from zero, not haunted by all those earlier failures. To be without words had been part of that dream. Now, on this wild point of land in this most distant of continents, that childish longing had come to pass. He had marvelled at it, a miraculous naked rebirth. A good place, he told her. Why had he said that, when it was not true? When you only had a few words to exchange, that was what happened. Truth needed hundreds of words, or none. She had nodded. She thought she understood, but how could she? He had not tried to explain how it had really been, how it was to be lonely among your own people. What was it like to be Tagaran? To walk about the woods, barefoot and naked, as easy as he had been on Church Street. He looked over his shoulder, but he was alone on the hillside. The urge was irresistible, like hunger or thirst, to unbuckle his shoes, peel off the worn stockings, and stand barefoot on Tagaran's earth. His feet were as white as those of fat caterpillars that were found here among rotting wood, vulnerable, weak-looking. He took a few wary steps along the track. Then he was jabbed in the heel by something sharp enough to make him gasp. When he looked, he saw it was only a piece of twig half the size of a toothpick. Was that how little it took to prevent him from walking in Tagaran's feet? All his life he had liked his own company better than anyone else's. But now he was full of unease, like being too hot or too cold, or hungry or thirsty. It was none of those. It was that he was no longer sufficient to himself. There was one human, of all the humans on this spinning globe, whose company he longed for. That was an education for a man who thought he knew most things. He had been foolish, standing on his dignity as a soldier of his majesty. He should simply have shot the damn thing off, and let her learn from it whatever she chose. Back at the hut, he got out the notebooks that contained their conversations. They were small enough that they could be covered by his hand. Shabby and insignificant, they were the most precious things he had ever owned. He did not expect her to return. What was recorded on these pages was all he would ever have of her. He opened one at random. There was that first ebullient entry, marée, wet. He could remember the triumph of it. He had been so satisfied with himself, he saw now that he had even put a full stop. He was chilled by the confidence of those entries. How misplaced had been his triumph. How wrong the dogmatism of that full stop. Marée. Yes, it might have meant wet. It might have meant raindrop, or on your hand. It might have meant dirty or mud, because the drops in his palm had made mud out of the dust that had been there. It might have meant pink, the colour of that palm, or skin, or braided line of love, dearie, the way the gypsy woman at Portsea Fair had once told him. But written down like that, with its little full stop, the possibility of doubt was erased. The meaning would never be questioned again. What had felt like science was the worst kind of guesswork, the kind that forgets it is a guess. And of course he knew now that Marée did not mean wet, but was an augmentive, something like very. When the boy ran off that first day, Tagaran had said, Yen Arabi, and he was sure it could only mean, he is gone. He could see now that he had wanted to understand too quickly. He took up his pen, dipped it in the ink and turned the full stop into a comma, adding, the English of which is not yet certain. He turned to the long entry which Silk had read, and relived all its awkwardness. Goredu Tagarin. I moor it. That is, I take more of it from cold. That is, to take off the cold. At this time Tagaran was standing by the fire naked, and I wished her to put on clothes, on which she said, Goredu Tagarin. The full meaning of which is, I will or do remain longer naked in order to get warm sooner. As the fires felt better without clothes than if it had to penetrate through them. Ingenious as this interpretation of Tagaran's words had been, it was not correct. He saw that, although Gore was to warm, Goredu could very well be a different word altogether. There was room between the lines for him to admit to his error. This is a mistake. Goredu signifies something else. Gore, to warm. He had thought himself superior to Silk, who was innocent and smug in his belief that there was a precise, unambiguous equivalence between words, and that one could exchange them as one might trade a Spanish dollar for 2 shillings and 5 pence. Now he saw that he had done the same. He had made these lists of verbs, these alphabets, these pages stretched like a net, other inflections of the same verb. But learning the Sydney tongue was not like that. Both the language and the act of learning had burst out of the boundaries he had tried to put around them. Proof of that was what he had just done. The press of the unknown had made him invent a new language, even newer to him than the Cadigal tongue, the language of doubt, the language that was prepared to admit, I am not sure. What he had not learned from Latin or Greek, he was learning from the people of New South Wales. It was this. You did not learn a language without entering into a relationship with the people who spoke it with you. His friendship with Tagaran was not a list of objects, or the words for things eaten or not eaten, thrown or not thrown. It was the slow constructing of the map of a relationship. The names of things, if you truly wanted to understand them, were as much about the spaces between the words as they were about the words themselves. Learning a language was not a matter of joining any 2 points with a line. It was a leap into the other. To understand the movements of the celestial bodies, it was necessary to leave behind everything you thought you knew. Until you could put yourself at some point beyond your own world, looking back at it, you would never see how everything worked together. In company with Tagaran, he had glimpsed how everything found its place with everything else. He was afraid that was all he would ever have, a glimpse. Part 4. To be of the party. Then Brugden crept into the settlement, with 1.5 feet of spear sticking out of the side of his chest. Rook heard of it when the boy from the regiment arrived gasping at his hut. "They got the gamekeeper, sir. He's done for." He could hardly speak for panting. But there was excitement in him too. The idea of being done for, nothing more than words for this red-faced boy, the blood vivid in his cheeks. Rook received the news numbly. The only surprise was his lack of surprise, the emptiness he felt within himself, The gap where happiness had once been was made concrete by this news. A bewitched time, an impossible time, had come to an end for his private self. Of course it should come to an end in a public way as well. "Major Wyatt says—" The boy screwed his eyes up tight to get the message right. "He says will Lieutenant Rook kindly attend at the barracks this evening at 6 o'clock, sir. With his compliments, that is." Rook thought. I can feign illness, can tell the boy that Lieutenant Rook sends his compliments but is indisposed. But Major Wyatt was nobody's fool. "Sir, to regard this as an order, he says," the boy went on, "and Lieutenant Rook to consider himself under obligation to be present." The boy gaped, trying to remember the Major's words. "No matter what, sir," was the gist of it. The news had gone around the settlement like a dark flood, and in the barracks the mood was ugly. Brugden had been allowed the authority that belonged to a soldier, even though he was not even a free man. No one around the table had liked that, or liked the man himself. But everyone knew that nothing could be the same now, because Brugden was the governor's own man. Silk was the centre of attention. It seemed that he was already master of the story. "The gamekeepers went to the place near Botany Bay that they call Kangaroo Ground," he said. "They saw some natives creeping towards them with spears in their hands, and the others were alarmed. 'Don't be afraid,' Brugden said. 'I know them.'" The room was silent, every man watching Silk as if seeing the picture he was so vividly drawing. But, Rook thought, how did Silk know it had been like that? He laid down his gun and spoke to them in their own tongue, of which he evidently knew a few words, as some of us do. But one of them jumped on a fallen tree, and without the least warning launched his spear, which lodged in Brugden's side, where it remains. He looked around as if expecting applause. "And?" Woolsted did not quite know what words to use. "Oh, he lives yet. The weapon penetrated his ribs, but did not kill him outright." There was stirring around the table. Relief or anticlimax? Was there even disappointment? Violence had an enlivening effect. As long as someone else was the victim, it made the blood pump, gave the world an edge of glamour. Rook was surprised at the harshness of his judgment. Silk had not finished. "Yes, he lives still." His voice was almost casual, so the men had to lean forward. "He will die, of course, but only by inches." "That poor devil," Timson murmured to Rook. "It could have been you or me, Rook. Mark my words, there will be no going back from this." But Silk raised his voice over the hubbub. "One of the natives was brought to the hospital. He told us that if any attempt were made to extract the spear, death would instantly follow." A silence fell around the table. Rook felt a dragging within him, deep and private and inescapable, the way he imagined the spear inside Brugden. You would long to rip it out. That would be the worst, knowing that you could not. You would die with it next to your heart, an enemy closer than any lover. Gamekeeper. He wondered whether that word had killed Brugden. "Wurrungen examined the spear," Silk continued, "and without the slightest hesitation pronounced the assailant to be one Karangaray of the Botany Bay tribe." Rook had heard Wurrungen speak of Karangaray. The man might even have been one of those who arrived now and then at Rook's hut, to be entertained by Wurrungen's mimicry of Major Wyatt. The anger in the room was like a draught against Rook's skin, or a smell in the air. He shrank into his corner at the end of the long table. He wished he were in his hut, the candle casting its friendly light, wished it yesterday, wished Brugden swaggering about as before, with no spear between his ribs. Something had ended, and something else was beginning. He wanted nothing to end, nothing to begin. "The gun is the only language the buggers will understand," Lennox said. "Mark my words. A few deaths and we would be shot of them for good. Forget all that flummery about amity and kindness." At the head of the table, Major Wyatt gazed into space, hearing nothing. Silk took it on himself to be the diplomat. "As we speak, His Excellency is considering the best course of action," he said. He went so far as to condescend to ask my opinion of various alternatives. I assure you, gentlemen, he has it well in hand and will act in the interests of every one of us. Rook caught the eye of Wilstead, sitting opposite, who rolled his eyes. But when, that is the question, he muttered to Rook behind his hand. How long will they go unpunished? How long before the governor does what he should have done months ago? Major Wyatt decided to acknowledge this and thundered from the end of the table. "Lieutenant Wilstead, I will thank you to have a care, if you please. Let us hear no more of this." Lennox had continued to think about what a musket might do. "Simple enough matter to round up some of the ones here among us," he said. "Make an example. We'll soon get back to the rest. They're all in league with each other, you know." "They none of them can be trusted," Wilstead said. "They have never been known to attack in a fair fight. They lurk and they skulk and they smile, and attack a man only when he is unarmed. I believe, in fact, that they do not even have a word for treachery in their vocabulary." On the word vocabulary, Silk glanced down the table at Rook, but said nothing. Rook had no idea whether the natives had a word for treachery. His conversations with Tagaran had never travelled in that direction. Even in English, treachery was a word with a broader reach than it was entitled to. What it boiled down to was that the men in this hut had been taught to fight by certain rules. Not fighting in accordance with those rules was treachery. There might be another way of looking at what the natives did, Rook thought. He imagined Wurunjin explaining. Uninvited guests had arrived in his home. They had been pleasant, offered small gifts. But then they had stayed, longer than visitors should, and rearranged the place to suit themselves. His grandmother had had a saying for it. "There are two things that stink after 3 days," she would say. "Fish and visitors." Late the next day, Rook heard footsteps outside. He leaped up from the table, in his haste knocking over the chair. He almost fell across the room to the doorway, but it was not Tagaran. For once, Silk was grave-faced. He came into the hut, taking a seat in front of the fire without waiting to be asked. "Well, Rook," he said, "it seems that we are to be sent out on a task of considerable significance." Rook busied himself filling their cups with sweet tea. Silk answered the question Rook had not asked. "To Botany Bay," he said, "where they got Brugden. The governor summoned me this afternoon. A punitive expedition is to be mounted, which I have the honour of leading." Rook saw a shine in his eye, and something about the corners of his mouth that was at odds with his solemn manner. "Well done," Rook said, and raised his cup. "Thank you, Rook. It is gratifying, I own, to have the governor's notice in this matter. Karangare, that is the name, I think, of the man." Rook's voice was flat, but he noticed with interest that his heart was beating fast. Silk took the raised cup as a toast, clinked his own against Rook's. "Karangare is indeed the name, and my instructions are simple. We are to bring in 6 of those natives who reside near the head of Botany Bay." 6 of the natives, not Karangare alone? Actually, Rook, between you and me, the governor had wished to bring in 10 men. I suggested that 6 would serve the purpose as well, and he was kind enough to agree with my view. 10 men, Rook said. "I see." But Silk was not concerned with arithmetic. "When the governor asked which men I wished to make up the party, naturally yours was the first name I mentioned. You and Wilstead and myself. 2 days, 30 privates, double rations." Rook smoothed with a finger at his cup, where a crack made a line down one side. He tried to picture it, the string of men walking through the woods, 30 men and the officers, double rations bouncing along in the packs on their backs, a musket hanging from its strap over every man's shoulder. He could see the picture, could hear the clanking of their kettles as they marched, the snapping of the twigs, but he could not see himself, could not put himself in that line of men, the compass in his hand, the gun over his own shoulder. Being reminded that he was a soldier, a man who had sworn to serve and obey, was like forcing open a rusted hinge. "No," he said without thinking. Once uttered, it seemed right. "I think not. No." The wind flung itself in spurts against the hut, rattling the flap of the door, making the canvas of the observatory dome thrum and snap. Silk fingered the whitewashed planks of the wall beside his shoulder. A speck of white drifted down, passing brilliantly, as if showing off through a beam of sunset that streamed in where the mud between the planks had fallen away. It was as if he had not heard Rook speak. The governor asked me, which officers would I take? I named them Rook and Wilstead. He licked his finger and used the spit to glue back some loose flakes of whitewash. See? He has your name, Rook. The stripe of sun fell on his scarlet shoulder, putting his face in shadow. I think no is not an answer. 30 men walking through the woods, each man watching his feet and the back of the man in front. And behind trees, and in the high places of rocks, the natives watching. Seeing Kamara, friend of Tagaran, a person in whose mouth their language was beginning to take shape, marching with the others, his musket over his shoulder. He could not think of the words that would turn Silk away. "Do you know, Silk?" he exclaimed, hearing his voice a little wild. "I have found that they use the dual plural, like Greek. Dual pronouns, too. I think, though I am not sure, but have collected some examples. You and me, or all of us, or me and these others, but not you, all embedded in the pronoun, while English makes only the crudest of distinctions. Imagine, Silk, a race of people using a language as supple as that of Sophocles and Homer." He was going to go on, his voice louder now with excitement, his hands drawing pictures on the air of you and me, of all of us, of me and these others, but not you. "Rook, I am beside myself with fascination," Silk said, "but Sophocles and Homer are not to the point. The point being, I have given your name to the governor. He has your name, and he knows you to be the best man for getting us there and back without losing our way. Now there's a good fellow. We'll leave on Wednesday, and we'll be gone 2 days, and there will be no more of this business of spearing our men as they go about their business in the woods." There was a long silence. The beam of sun had moved, or perhaps it was Silk's shoulder. Rook watched his foot, moving the toe of his worn old shoe into the sun, out of the sun. He could not say to Silk, "I cannot do this, because the men we bring in might be the uncles, the cousins, even the brothers of Tagaran. Could not say, I cannot do this, because I am too fond of Tagaran." "Fond?" he imagined Silk repeating. "Too fond of a native girl to obey an order?" "Do not ask me," Rook said. "As you are a friend, do not ask me. I would not deny you, only do not ask. I have friends here among the natives, as you know." Silk cleared his throat. "Yes, I am, shall we say, aware. But, Rook, think this is not a request, it is an order." Rook watched dust puff and subside in the shaft of sunlight. Dust seemed weightless until you watched it fall. "You know as well as I do, Rook, the way they hide in the woods. We know how clever they are at hiding. When have we ever succeeded in finding natives who did not want to be found?" His face was warm, coaxing. Silk was right. They watched from behind trees and rocks, their skins part of the speckled light and shade of the place. From half a mile away, they would hear the passage of 30 men through the woods, 60 feet crushing leaves and twigs underfoot, 60 hands pushing bushes aside, 30 kettles clanking on 30 packs, not to mention the officers, another 3 packs, another 6 shoes, 2 of them belonging to himself. "Rook, old fellow," Silk said, "you know the governor cannot let the spearing of that poor wretch go unremarked. His own gamekeeper, a terrible lingering death ahead of the poor devil. A show of force is required, 30 armed men. Would he be ordering a force of that size to take a handful of natives? You could think of it as a piece of theatre, Rook, if you wished." Rook could imagine Wurunjin in his gregarious mood, telling the story of how the white men had blundered through the woods while he watched from behind a tree. "I know you are a man of principle, my friend, and I respect you for it," Silk said. "Your scruples do you credit. But this is a simple enough thing. 2 days on the march, and then life will resume as before. He did not wait for Rook to say yes. We leave on Wednesday, at sunrise. I will send the lad out with your rations and so on. Silk was too quick, Rook thought. He had run along the broad road of his argument and arrived at the end, panting and pleased, while Rook was at a standstill, trying to remember how to put one foot in front of the other. Silk reached for his hand, shook it. Good man, Rook. Until Wednesday. And was gone. It was time for the evening reading of the instruments. Mechanically, Rook went through the motions. He walked between each instrument and the ledger, dipping the pen in the ink, putting the number where it belonged. Wind south-southwest, 3 knots, weather fine, remarks none. He wished Gardner were here. His absence was like a cold wound. He was the only man whose advice he would trust. What would Gardner say? He remembered the grim way Gardner had agreed that they were all loyal subjects of the Crown. He had never again referred to the duty that was, by far, the most unpleasant he ever had to execute. Gardner would spell out the consequences of refusal. Rook had done the same for him, remind him that the service of humanity and the service of His Majesty were not congruent. It had been simple enough to speak to Gardner of duty. It must have sounded glib, he thought now. He wished he could tell Gardner, I am sorry, my friend, I spoke too easily. Until this point in his life, he had allowed himself to be propelled by circumstance, situation, need. He had never had to take the grain of life in his bare hands and twist it to another shape. Never stopped and asked, but what am I doing? Silk's logic seemed unassailable. The expedition would fail, and so there was no reason to refuse it. But if the governor were merely performing a piece of theatre in the interests of intimidation, where was the fearsomeness? What was the deterrent, if the terrific procession met not a single native because they were all laughing from behind bushes as it passed? The logic is faulty, you see. He was startled to find he had spoken aloud. Still the central fact remained. The expedition would fail. Whether or not the governor hoped to capture 6 natives, and whether or not Silk hoped the same, it was almost certain that no native would be caught. Almost. It could be done, however, he said. He could see how a man might get into the habit of talking to himself. It cleared the mind to hear the words aloud, as if spoken by a sympathetic other who knew you as well as you knew yourself. I could do it. Rook could have gone looking for Warrengen or Boinbar, but that would have meant allowing himself to know what he was doing. Instead, he set off towards the settlement, as if on some errand. He watched his feet on the uneven ground, and did not think beyond one step, another step. He left the thing to chance, and chance gave him the boy Bonada, sitting by the track on a rock. He could not have been waiting for Rook, but showed no surprise at seeing him. He held out the thing in his fist, a fat lizard, not quite dead. In a stream of words and gestures, Rook only partly followed. Bonada said something to the effect of, I caught it over there. It ran very fast. I'm going to eat it, and it will be very good. There was something that the eyes of the natives did when they smiled. A gleam under their heavy brows, so that the smile seemed to come from within as much as from the play of muscles on the face. I want to see Tagaran. It sounded very blunt, like that, but it had to be clear, and he trusted Bonada's English more than his own Cadigal. Will she come to visit me? Will she come to my hut? Will you tell her Camara wants to see her? Bonada said something Rook could not follow, pointed in a generally west direction with his stick, and was gone, springing up the rocks towards the ridge. Had he understood? Rook did not know. He turned and made his way back to the hut. He lit his fire, just a few sticks smoking away together. That was to say, I am at home and would welcome a visitor. Then he lay on his stretcher, hands under his head, staring up at the shingles without seeing them. He did not sleep, but had submerged into a stupor when there was a shadow in the doorway. Tagaran was there, hesitating. He swung his legs down and sat on the side of the bed. She was alone. She had never arrived alone before. She came in and sat at his table, smoothing at the grain of the wood with a finger. She was waiting for him to speak. He was waiting for a miracle that would free him from the thing that had fallen on him like a great heavy cloak. He got up and sat at the table opposite her. "Why?" he asked in English. "Why did the black man wound the white man?" Her face, wary, lifted to his. "Gullara," she said, just that word, angry. "Minin Gullara Eroa," Rook asked. "Why are the black men angry?" He knew the answer, but needed the words, needed the thing they were used to, the question and the answer. "Inyam and Galui white men, because the white men are settled here." He thought perhaps she needed it too, backwards and forwards, word and word. One long hand smoothed down her forearm from elbow to wrist, as if she were cold. He saw a line of pink dots that marked the graze she had received from the person from Charlotte. She was looking down again. He could not see her face, only the tip of her nose and her hair. "Tiarun Cadigal," she said without looking up. "The Cadigal are afraid." Her fingers smoothed at the mahogany, as if she could rub away the surface and see something else beneath it. "The musket," he began. "Remember, you asked me, you wished to learn, to make it shoot, to load it and shoot it." She went on rubbing at the polished wood, but he knew she was listening. "Why, Tagaran? Why did you wish to know? Will you tell me?" He heard the water slapping fretfully against the rocks at the foot of the promontory. A loose shingle rattled, the canvas of the dome creaked, a gull gave a long, rueful cry. He might wait all day and hear other things, but he saw that he would not hear an answer. He went back a step. "Minin Tiarun Cadigal," he asked. "Why are the Cadigal afraid?" "Gunnin." She looked him straight in the eye, because of the guns. The word was like a gunshot in itself. "Brogden," he said. He would have given the poor devil his other name, but realized he did not know it. Tagaran tilted her face even further towards the table. She knew who Brogden was and what had happened to him. He took a breath and made himself go on. "Brogden will die." Tagaran did not look at him. So far he had told her nothing she did not already know. "They are going out after Karangare." She looked up as if he had shouted. Her hand went to her mouth, and her face changed shape around this piece of information. He sketched the movement of putting a musket up to his shoulder. "Tomorrow, Parebugo, for Karangare, for others too, 6 men, 6 Eroa." He held up fingers to show her. That was probably enough, but having come so far, there was a luxurious yielding in going all the way to the end. "Piabami Warunjini. Will you tell Warunjin? I would like you to let Warunjin know." Tagaran looked straight into his eyes. She understood. He could see that. Not just the words, but the significance of him having said them to her. "Piabami Warunjini," he said again. There was a pleasure in using her language for this. Each word started emphatically and dropped away, and each sentence did the same, a sequence of diminuendos. It was a language whose very cadence sounded like forgiveness. "Botany Bay," she said, "for Karangare," and copied his gesture, the musket up to her shoulder. "Yes," Rook said, "tomorrow in the morning." He could hear a bird above them chattering as if scolding, the dry whisper of the leaves. Everything was going on as it always had. For centuries, for millennia, the forebears of that bird had sat out there, and the forebears of those leaves had whispered in that breeze. Only in here were things changed. "I too, I am to be of the party." It was a relief to say the words, but did not give the satisfaction he had hoped. Like a child, he had thought that putting the thing into words would make it go away. But it was still sitting between them, while outside that callous bird did not seem to realize there was nothing to sing about. What is to be done, Tagaran? What is to become of us? This was a question beyond the game of words. It was out of the reach of their grammar lessons. She went over to the fireplace and held out her hands to the coals. He thought it was her polite way of ending their conversation, but then she turned back to him and held out her hands for his. She pressed his fingers with her own. He felt her skin, warm and smooth. "Putowa," she said, pressing and smoothing. "Putowa." Their hands were the same temperature now. "Putowa," he repeated. She pressed harder, smoothing with larger gestures, and he understood the word to mean the action she was performing. That is, to warm one's hand by the fire, and then to squeeze gently the fingers of another person. In English, it required a long rigmarole of words. In England, a person who warmed their hands by the fire did so in order to thrust them into their pockets and keep them warm. Tagaran was teaching him a word, and by it she was showing him a world. Everything in his life had come down to the sensation of her fingers against his. The person he was, the history he carried within himself, every joy and grief he had ever experienced, slipped away like an irrelevant garment. He was nothing but skin, speaking to another skin, and between the skins there was no need to find any words. A laughing jackass began to peal from somewhere up on the ridge, and, as if she had heard a clock chiming, reminding her of something she must do, Tagaran let go of his fingers. "Yeniu, Kamara," she said. "I'm going, my friend." She looked up at him, and he thought he saw in her face the same thought he had. This is the last time we will see each other. He groped for words, and none came. He would not give a word to the bleakness he felt, could not say it. Goodbye. He followed her out of the hut, watching her climb the rocks. As he hoped, at the top she turned. He raised his arm, straight up, the hand opened towards her, and she waved back. Then she turned and was gone. In his mind he went with her, following her along the path, turning towards the camp in the next bay, watching her go down the long traverse of the hillside, past the big rock that was as far into her world as he had ever gone. She would arrive in the clear place where the fire sent up its column of smoke, and the women sat on the ground as if growing out of it, where the children ran and poked among the mangroves, and where, when the sun went down, they all came together to eat and sleep. The picture was so vivid in his mind that it was a shock to find himself not there but here, alone on his windy point. Putowa. Just as he did, she knew that something ugly was on its way, but she had left him a word he would never forget, and the weight of trust it carried. This is the end of CD 5. The book continues on CD 6. I'd also like to express my deepest thanks to the many generous readers who contributed their knowledge and insight to this book. All errors are my own. My greatest debt is to Pattigarang and the Cadigal people, who were willing to share their language, and to William Dawes, who wrote some of it down. Without them, the lieutenant could not have been imagined. Belinda Audio hopes you enjoyed the reading of The Lieutenant, written by Kate Grenville and read by Nicholas Bell. For further information about the Belinda Audio range, please visit our website www.belinda.com. If you like this audiobook, please tell a friend.